A poor young farmer bought a horse everyone laughed at, but what that animal led him to, no one in town will ever forget. Under the blazing Texas sun, Luke Tanner spent his days fighting a land that had forgotten rain, until the night he bought a half-blind horse no one wanted, and the next morning that same creature led him to something buried deep beneath the dust, something that would change every life in the valley. The wind that crossed the Texas hill country carried the taste of iron and dust. It rasped against the dry mesquite branches and whistled through the cracks in the Tanner barn, where Luke stood with a shovel buried in the brittle ground. Every thrust met stone or nothingness. The soil was so dry it rang hollow, like striking an old drum. Sweat burned his eyes, but even the act of wiping it away felt pointless. No clouds had passed overhead in months. He leaned on the shovel and stared out across the fields that used to belong to his father. The pasture, once green and humming with insects, was now the color of ash. The few cattle he had left stood around the stock tank that had become a bowl of dust. In the distance, a windmill squealed and spun without purpose, its blades catching air that carried no promise. Luke wasn't a man who complained out loud. The drought had stolen too many voices already. Neighbors had packed their things and left, leaving mailboxes stuffed with final notices and memories. The feed store was shuttered. The diner opened only 3 days a week. Each night, the sky bled red over the hills, a beauty so cruel it almost mocked him. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of heat and rust. His father's hat hung by the door, coated in years of dust that no one dared wipe away. The old man's photograph sat on the table beside a cracked mug, his smile faint, his eyes stubborn. Luke picked up the mug and turned it in his hands, tracing the hairline fractures with his thumb. "You'd have figured it out, huh?" he whispered to the empty room. But the silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Bills lay spread across the counter. Property tax, feed credit, the notice from the bank. He folded them once, twice, and set them aside like folding a flag for burial. When the land stopped giving, time slowed in cruel ways. He worked from dawn to dark, but the soil gave nothing back. It was as if the earth itself had stopped listening. That night, he sat on the porch, boots on the rail, eyes on the horizon. Somewhere in town, he knew, the monthly horse auction would be starting. He'd gone once as a kid, back when his father bought colts with futures ahead of them, strong, spirited animals that kicked and snorted at the smell of freedom. Now those same auctions sold ghosts, horses people could no longer afford to feed, or ones that had lost their shine. The radio on the porch crackled with static before catching a voice. "Horse auction tonight, Cooper Barn, Junction Road. Consignments start at 6. Luke stared at the dark hills beyond his fence, then back at the shovel resting by the barn. He didn't need another mouth to feed. He could barely keep himself above water. Yet something in that dry wind made him restless. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was madness. He stood, brushing the dust from his jeans, and walked to his truck. The engine coughed twice before catching. Headlights sliced through the dusk as he pulled onto the dirt road that led toward town. Along the way, he passed fields of cracked soil, broken fences, and barns collapsing inward. Life here was peeling away layer by layer. By the time he reached the auction yard, the sun was bleeding out behind the ridges, turning everything copper. The old wooden barn loomed ahead, its sign faded but still legible. Horse auction tonight. Cars and trailers lined the lot like weary survivors of some forgotten battle. Luke parked at the edge and sat for a moment, watching the silhouettes of people moving under the weak lights. He wasn't sure what had brought him there. Curiosity, maybe? Or the need to see that someone else's loss was greater than his own. He took a deep breath, tasted the dust, and stepped out of the truck. The air was thick with the smell of hay, sweat, and hopelessness. Inside, the hum of conversation mixed with the drone of an old ceiling fan. Men in hats leaned on railings, talking about weather patterns that hadn't changed in years, and horses that would never work again. Somewhere in that noise, Luke heard his father's voice from long ago. "You judge a horse by its eyes, not its price." The auctioneer's voice rang out, tired but practiced. Numbers climbed and fell, each sale a story of surrender. Luke moved toward the back, keeping his distance, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't plan to buy anything. He didn't plan to do anything at all. Until, through the shifting crowd, he saw her. A pale horse, ribs sharp under a thin coat the color of sun-worn straw. A rope mark ringed her neck, old but visible, like a memory that hadn't healed. Her eyes, one hazel, one clouded, searched the air, but didn't seem to see. The crowd quieted a little. Someone muttered, "That one's used up." Another voice laughed. "You'd have to pay me to take her." Luke felt something twist in his chest. He didn't know if it was pity or recognition, but it rooted him to the spot. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to keep the rhythm. "Lot 23. Mare, 8 years old. Needs care. Let's start at 100. Silence. 75? More silence. 50? And before he could stop himself, Luke heard his own voice. 50. The sound cut through the dust and chatter. Heads turned. Someone snorted a laugh. The auctioneer blinked, then banged his gavel once. "Sold." Luke Tanner stood still as the crowd murmured, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. A man near the rail shook his head. "Kid, that horse ain't worth the rope she's tied with." But Luke wasn't listening. He was already walking toward the pens at the back, the faint scent of hay and sweat in the air, wondering, not for the first time, why sometimes the things we save are the ones that end up saving us. The barn was older than most of the men standing inside it. Its beams were darkened by years of smoke, sweat, and oil from the lanterns that used to hang there before the county installed electric lights. Tonight, those lights hummed low, casting a yellow haze over everything. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and cigarette smoke. Dust floated like gold flecks in the beams of light, swirling above the crowd that filled the bleachers. Luke stood near the back, hands in his pockets, the brim of his hat low. The sound of the auctioneer's chant rolled over him, steady and mechanical. The rhythm of a man who had said the same words for 30 years. "We'll start at 200. Do I hear 2? 250. Now 3. Sold at 350. A faint applause followed each deal, quick and lifeless. He didn't belong here. He knew that the way you know a song is off-key. Most of the men wore pressed shirts and clean boots, ranchers still holding on to some illusion of prosperity. Luke's jeans were dust-caked, his boots cracked from too many summers without rain. He had come out of curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe just to hear voices that weren't his own. When the auctioneer called for a short break, the crowd dispersed toward the water troughs and soda machine by the wall. Luke stayed where he was. From this angle, he could see the pens in the back, the holding area where the horses waited their turn. Some pawed at the straw, ears twitching nervously. Others stood still, motionless in resignation. It reminded him of people waiting for a bus they knew would never come. Then the noise quieted. The auctioneer returned to the stand, wiping sweat from his neck with a red handkerchief. "All right, folks, we're moving on to the next section. These are the strays and rescues. Some might still have a few good years in them. Let's see what we've got." A wrangler opened the gate, and a thin mare was led out, her coat so pale it caught the weak light and reflected it like moonstone. Her hooves clacked on the wooden floor as she stumbled once, then steadied herself. The murmurs started almost immediately. "Too skinny. Ain't worth the feed. Looks half blind." Luke's first thought was that she didn't look broken, just lost. The mare's eyes moved slowly over the crowd, one a warm amber, the other cloudy and dull. Around her neck, faint but visible, was a scar that looped like an old rope burn. She stood with her head lowered, not in fear, but in a kind of quiet surrender that hit Luke harder than he expected. The auctioneer's voice tried to lift the mood. "Lot 23, Palomino Mare, approximately 8 years old, gentle, temperament needs some care. We'll start at 100. Silence. 75? Nothing. 50? He hesitated, and someone in the crowd laughed. A short, sharp sound that carried. Luke didn't know why he spoke. Maybe it was the way the mare's ears flicked toward him as if she had heard something no one else did. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand another moment of that laughter. 50, he said, voice low but clear. The gavel hit the block like a gunshot. Sold to the young man in the back. The auctioneer's tone carried relief more than excitement. The crowd murmured, some snickering, others shaking their heads. Luke caught the disapproving look of a gray-haired rancher nearby. "Kid, that mare's a waste of $50, the man muttered, spitting into the straw. Luke said nothing. He walked toward the back pens where the transactions were handled. The clerk, a woman with a sunburned face and silver hair tied back, gave him a faint, knowing smile. "Paperwork?" she asked. He nodded, signing the forms with the stub of a pencil. "She's a gentle one," the woman said quietly, "but she's seen things. You can tell by the scar." Luke didn't ask what kind of things. He just nodded, folded the receipt, and slid it into his pocket. When he approached the mare, she stood still as he unlatched the gate. Up close, she smelled of dust and old sweat, but beneath that was the faint scent of hay and something warm, something alive. Her ribs were visible, but there was strength in the way she shifted her weight, as if she hadn't forgotten what it meant to stand proud. Luke reached for the rope and paused. "You're a quiet one," he murmured. The mare flicked an ear, but didn't move. He slipped the lead rope over her neck, and for a moment their eyes met, his tired blue against her weary amber. There was a flicker of recognition there, like two travelers passing on the same long road. Outside, the evening air was cooler, but only slightly. The horizon burned orange, the sun melting into the hills. Luke led the mare toward his trailer, her hooves leaving soft prints in the dust. He could feel the stares of the other ranchers behind him, but none of it mattered now. As he loaded her into the trailer, she hesitated once, turning her head toward the barn as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with a soft sigh, she stepped inside. The door clanged shut. Luke rested his hand against the metal, feeling the heat fade under his palm. "Let's get you home," he said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth. Home wasn't something he'd said out loud in a long time. He climbed into the truck, turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. As he drove away, the lights of the auction barn grew smaller in the rearview mirror until they disappeared completely. Ahead lay 30 miles of open road, empty and silent. In the trailer behind him, he could hear the mare shifting her weight, the dull rhythm of hooves against steel. The night wrapped around them, endless and starless. And for the first time in months, Luke Tanner didn't feel entirely alone. The drive back to the ranch took nearly an hour, though the road stretched so empty it felt longer. The truck's headlights carved through the dark, revealing nothing but fences and the pale dust that drifted like smoke. Luke kept glancing at the side mirror, at the trailer bumping behind him. Every few miles, he'd catch a faint sound, a shift of hooves, a hollow thud, as if the mare inside was reminding him she was still there. By the time he reached home, the moon had climbed high, hanging over the hills like a coin left out too long in the sun. He backed the trailer up to the barn, cut the engine, and listened. For a long minute, there was no sound but the ticking of the cooling motor. The air felt heavy, filled with the dry scent of cedar and old wood. He stepped down, boots crunching on gravel, and unlatched the door. The mare stood motionless, her head low, ears twitching toward the night insects outside. "Easy, girl," Luke said softly. His voice came out rough, unused to kindness. She blinked once and stepped backward, cautious but not defiant. He led her into an empty stall, the boards creaking under their weight. Dust puffed up around their feet. The barn smelled like hay that hadn't been fresh in months. Spiderwebs shone in the moonlight. He tied the rope loosely to the post, then fetched a bucket of water and a handful of feed. The mare didn't move when he set it down, just stared at the bucket as though she didn't trust it. Her ribs caught the silver light, each breath shallow but steady. Luke leaned on the gate, watching. "You've had a rough road," he murmured. "Guess we both have." He didn't expect her to respond, but she flicked her tail once, slow and deliberate, like punctuation to a sentence only she understood. After a while, she bent her head and took a sip of water. Hesitant at first, then greedily, as if the cold touch surprised her. Luke smiled despite himself. The smallest things had started to matter again. Inside the house, the air was even drier than outside. He poured himself a glass of water that tasted faintly of iron and leaned against the counter. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Every sound in that house had started to sound lonely. He could hear the night pressing against the windows, the distant hum of the highway, the faint rustle of the mare in the barn. He thought about the look people had given him at the auction, the way their eyes slid past him, pity mixed with disbelief. Maybe they were right. He'd bought another problem, another mouth to feed when his own fields were dying. But when he closed his eyes, he saw that scar around her neck and the strange calm in her mismatched eyes. There was something there that felt familiar. Not hope exactly, but recognition. The next morning, the world was still colorless. A weak sunrise spread across the hills like diluted paint. Luke stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. The sound of hooves shifting in the barn carried across the yard. He walked over, the boards creaking under his weight, and found the mare awake, watching him. "Morning, Solace," he said. The name came out of nowhere. It just fit. The mare blinked slowly, as if accepting it. He opened the stall, unhooked the rope, and tried to lead her outside. She resisted at first, planting her hooves in the straw. Luke tugged gently, then stepped back. "All right," he said. "We'll do it your way." He walked out ahead of her and waited. After a moment, she followed, her steps uncertain but steady. The sun rose higher, its light already sharp. Dust swirled in the air like faint smoke trails. Luke watched Solace lift her head and breathe in, her nostrils flaring. She turned toward the far fence line, ears flicking forward, and stood there for a long time. He followed her gaze, nothing but dry earth, a few mesquite trees, and the shimmer of heat. "You miss the open fields, huh?" he asked quietly. She didn't move. He fetched a curry brush and began to clean her coat. Beneath the grime, her color showed through. Pale gold, soft as wheat. The brushstrokes raised clouds of dust that caught in the sunlight. She flinched once when he brushed near the scar, then relaxed. The sound of the bristles and the steady rhythm of her breathing filled the silence between them. When he was done, she turned her head and looked at him fully for the first time. For a moment, her eyes, one bright, one clouded, seemed to catch something inside him, something that had gone quiet long ago. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. The wind outside rattled the loose tin on the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound echoed across the barren fields. He closed his eyes and thought of Solace standing in her stall, alone, but calm. He wondered where she had come from, what kind of people had tied a rope so tight it left a ring around her neck. He pictured her being led away, her hooves dragging through the dust, and felt a sharp ache in his chest. He turned over, pressing his face into the pillow. "She's just a horse," he told himself. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Before dawn, he woke to the sound of something moving outside, the faint thud of hooves. He threw on his boots and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, still, the sky pale with the first light. At the far end of the yard, near the broken fence, Solace was standing, head bent low. She pawed at the dirt, deliberate, patient. Luke rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "What are you doing, girl?" he called softly. She didn't look up. She pawed again, scraping until dust rose like smoke. Then she stopped, lifted her head, and turned toward him. There was nothing remarkable about the spot she'd chosen, just another patch of dead grass and cracked earth. But as Luke stood there, watching her in the early light, he thought he saw something different about the ground. The soil looked darker, richer somehow. The faint scent of earth. Not dust, but real earth, carried on the wind. He frowned, stepping closer, but before he could reach her, Solace turned away and walked back toward the barn. The wind shifted, and the smell vanished. Luke stood there, staring at the spot, uncertain if he'd imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was the first small thing the land had tried to tell him in a long, long while. At first light, he returned to the place where Solace had pawed, carrying a short-handled shovel and the kind of caution a man uses when approaching a fragile truth. The ground looked no different from any other stretch of sunburned pasture, cracked like old porcelain, colored the tired brown of worn-out leather. But when he set the shovel's edge and leaned his weight, the soil didn't clatter the way dead ground does. It yielded grudgingly, as if remembering how. He knelt, pressing his palm to the loosened dirt. It was cool. Not wet, not yet, but cooler than the air. A breath of something rose from the hole, faint and dark, like a cellar after a long summer. He closed his eyes and let the smell settle into him, the way a song finds the room it belongs to. Memory flickered. His father's boots in this same field, the old man talking about, listening to a place, the way other folks listened to weather reports or bank managers who didn't care. Luke dug again, careful not to let hope outrun sense. A few inches down, the shovel struck something that rang, soft metal under earth. He brushed away soil and uncovered the lip of a rusted coupling, the kind used to join pipe lengths that had not moved in decades. His throat tightened. He widened the hole, hands working faster, until a foot of narrow pipe showed itself like an old vein. The end was capped, corroded green. He probed along the line with his fingers and found the trench faintly firmer where the pipe likely ran. Right toward the mesquite stump his father had always refused to cut, for reasons he'd never explained. He sat back on his heels, breath shallow. "You're kidding me," he said to the empty morning. Solace stood 20 yards away, head high, ears forward, as if she'd been waiting for him to catch up to something she already knew. He raised a hand without thinking. A thanks, a salute, he wasn't sure which. The mare took a step, then stopped, patient as a fence post, wind combing her white mane. The pump in the shed hadn't turned since last fall. He dragged it out anyway, knocking off spider webs, checking cracked seals with the resigned focus of a man who couldn't afford a new one and might not qualify for another small business loan even if he tried. The primer can was half full, the label curling. He thought about the words he'd read last night while pretending not to. Final notice, mortgage, insurance lapse. He thought about the farm insurance agent who'd stopped by in June to remind him of risk and liability and the importance of planning for disasters that had already arrived. Then he thought about the smell rising from that narrow hole and decided disaster could wait. He ran a hose from the pump intake to the pipe and used the primer as the old man had taught him. A steady pour, a soft curse, a prayer no one would hear. The pump coughed once, then twice, then settled into a dogged whir that trembled through the shed floorboards. Nothing happened at the trench. 10 seconds, 20. Sweat slid down his spine and disappeared into a shirt that hadn't known a washing machine in too long. He checked the fittings and tightened a clamp with a wrench whose handle had been wrapped in his father's electrical tape years ago. The pump stumbled, caught itself, stumbled again. "Come on," he said, not to the machine. A sound rose from the trench, a questioning gulp, almost a swallow, then subsided. He leaned closer, holding his breath the way you do before a doctor says a word you can't take back. Another swallow came, stronger, and a thin thread pushed up at the seam where soil met coupling. It wasn't a flow. It wasn't even a trickle. It was the mere idea of water, a bead that trembled and sank. He laughed anyway, a short, surprised sound that made the sparrows lift from the fence. "Okay," he whispered, grinning like an idiot at a damp outline. "Okay." He shut the pump before it burned itself up, then sat in the dust and stared at the pipe as if it might tell him a story. Solace walked closer, her shadow falling across his boots. She lowered her head, nostrils widening over the turned earth, and made a soft sound he hadn't heard from her yet. Part sigh, part greeting. He reached up and touched the pale hair at her jaw. "You knew," he said, and the mare blinked, unbothered by praise. By midday, the heat hammered down. He unspooled a second hose to the mesquite stump and probed the ground with a length of rebar. 6 feet out from the stump, the steel met hollow, the ghost of a trench. He followed it, step by careful step, until the rebar pinged again. Another join. Another length of pipe asleep under the pasture. He scraped away dirt with a gardener's trowel he'd once used for tomatoes that never came in. The trowel's handle had his mother's initials burned into it, and for a second the field turned into a kitchen, alive with jars and vinegar and the hot metallic sting of summer canning. Then the heat snapped him back. The pump primed twice more and shuddered into a steadier rhythm. The bead at the first trench became 2, then a seam of damp that darkened the dirt in the shape of a crescent. He swiped the back of his wrist across his eyes and tasted salt and grit. A sensible man would shut everything down, map the line, call a proper well service, and ask about a payment plan. Maybe mortgage refinance before the bank changed its mind again. A sensible man would measure before believing. Luke stood there and believed anyway. He fetched 2 5-gallon buckets and set them near the trench, not because he needed them, but because the gesture felt like making room at a table for a guest not yet arrived. Solace drifted to the shade of the barn and dozed, her lower lip slack in that comic way horses have when they finally feel safe enough to let go. He watched her from the corner of his eye and realized the sound in his chest, something slow and unfamiliar, was ordinary happiness, shy and skittish as a fawn. Toward evening, the light turned the pasture into hammered brass. He killed the pump to keep from blowing a seal, then walked the line again, boot soles raising dry whispers. At the mesquite stump, he knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. It was foolish. It was also the most honest thing he had done in months. Under the rattle of insects and the distant complaint of the windmill, he imagined he heard movement, the faintest traveling hush, like cloth pulled through a ring. He smiled at the thought, embarrassed by his own imagination, then kept listening. A pickup rolled slow along the county road and stopped by his gate. Sheriff Boyd leaned out the window, hat tilted, forearm freckled with sun. "Evening, Luke." "Sheriff. Folks said you bought a horse last night. Didn't figure you for sentimental." "A horse ain't sentimental," Luke said. "She's work." The sheriff studied the trench, the hoses, the pump cooling beside the shed. "You drilling without a permit?" he asked, not unkindly. "Just waking up what's already here." Boyd's mouth twitched. "That a theological statement or you got a plumber hid out back?" Luke shrugged. "Neither." The sheriff looked past him toward Solace, who had lifted her head to watch the exchange. "Pretty mare," he said. "Thin. You know feed's high." "I know." "You also know if this place turns into a mess, the county's gonna come sniffing. Best to do it right." "I plan to," Luke said, which was true in the way a man plans to live forever. Boyd tipped his hat. "All right, keep your nose clean, and if you need a list of licensed well folks, call Marla at the diner. She's got everyone's numbers memorized." The truck rolled on. Luke stood in the slow falling light until the sound of tires faded completely. He turned back to Solace. "You heard that?" he asked. "We're official now, practically a government project." The mare chewed the last of a dry alfalfa flake and flicked an ear that said she had no patience for politics or attorney talk or any other noise that couldn't fill a bucket. Twilight drew the color down out of the world. He filled Solace's water, added a scoop of mineral the vet had sworn by, then locked the barn with the easy ritual of a man who kept very little and guarded it all. Inside the house, he rinsed the dust from his hands and stared at his reflection in the sink window. A stranger who looked like his father, and not at all like the boy who used to run this field with a plastic flag and a dog that answered to everything. He thought of maps, the kind his father used to draw on feed store calendars. Looping blue lines for pipe, X's for valves. Then he thought of the junk closet where old calendars turned into nests for screws and receipts and promises. He found them under a box of mason lids. 3 calendars, years apart, each with the same sketch of the south pasture. The lines were faint but readable. One note, in his father's tired block letters, said, "Cap near mesquite until we can afford proper pump. Don't forget where it sleeps." Luke carried the calendars out to the porch and sat with them spread across his knees while the cicadas took up their evening hymn. Solace nickered once from the barn, a soft sound that threaded the distance between them. He traced the pipe's route with his finger. It matched the trench he'd felt with the rebar. Where his father had written cap, a small circle sat exactly where the faint seam of damp had appeared. He laughed, then let the sound empty into the dark until only the quiet remained. The stars came on one by one. Coyotes sang farther off than usual. The pump cooled, the metal ticking softly. He folded the calendars and laid them beside the door with the reverence people save for Bibles and birth certificates. For a long time he watched the yard, the shape of the mesquite stump, the barely darker patch where the day had given back a breath of moisture. "Tomorrow," he said into the night, to the ground, to the mare he had named without asking. "We try again." From the barn, the answering shuffle of hooves felt like agreement. And with that sound, the promise of a map in his pocket, and the faint taste of earth still in his mouth, Luke Tanner walked inside, knowing that what he had found wasn't just a pipe. It was the beginning of remembering what his father had tried to leave behind. Morning came quietly, the kind that makes a man think twice before breaking the silence. Luke woke with the first light and sat for a while at the edge of his bed, listening to the slow creak of the house. The old boards carried every sound, the settling of wood, the distant tick of the cooling pump outside, and the rhythmic thud of Solace's hooves as she shifted in the barn. The smell of coffee, bitter and faint, hung in the air. When he stepped out, the horizon was already glowing, a smear of gold and copper. Dew clung to the sparse grass like someone had tried to paint life back onto the land and run out halfway through. He walked toward the trench where the pipe still slept beneath the dirt. The spot looked unchanged, but when he pressed his palm to the soil, he could still feel that cool breath underneath. He smiled, half doubt, half belief. Solace was waiting at the gate, her mane tangled from sleep. She followed him to the trench without being asked, her steps steady, her ears flicking toward the whisper of windmills in the distance. Luke ran a hand along her neck. "You brought me back here, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Guess we're not done." He set to work with a shovel and a crowbar, digging along the line the old calendars had marked. The sun climbed fast, turning the air thick. Sweat trickled down his back, and his hands burned from the handle's rough wood. Each time he thought about stopping, he'd glance at Solace standing nearby, watching like a patient foreman. A metallic scrape broke the rhythm. The shovel hit something solid again. He knelt and brushed away dirt until he found another section of pipe, the coupling still capped but faintly damp. A surge of emotion hit him: pride, grief, disbelief. He rested his hand on the pipe as though touching a grave. "This was yours, wasn't it, Dad?" he murmured. "You were so damn close." He remembered being 10 years old, sitting on the back of his father's truck, watching him sketch maps on the back of feed sacks, lines for irrigation that never got built, wells that never filled. His father used to talk about making the ranch self-sufficient again, a place that could live through anything. Luke had stopped believing that after the funeral. Yet here he was, chasing the same ghost. He went back to the shed and dragged out the toolbox, found a pipe wrench, and pried at the coupling. It resisted, then gave with a sharp metallic sigh. A trickle of dark water seeped out, smelling faintly of iron. He blinked hard, afraid the tears might come if he let them. Solace stepped forward, sniffed the air, and stamped once, her tail flicking like punctuation. "Yeah," Luke said, wiping his arm across his face. "It's a start." He set up the pump again, tightening the fittings, muttering small things under his breath, snippets of prayer and curse intermingled. When the engine coughed to life, he leaned over the trench. The first burst of air hissed out, then came a shudder, and then the miracle. Water, thin but real, spilling over the lip and darkening the soil. It wasn't much, just a weak, brownish flow, but to Luke it might as well have been a river. He laughed, a sound that startled Solace. "You see that? You really see that?" he said, voice hoarse. He dipped his hands into the stream, let the grit run between his fingers. It tasted like rust, like memory, like home. By afternoon, the sun was high, and the weak flow had stopped again, but the smell of damp earth lingered. Luke turned off the pump to keep it from burning out. He sat on the ground, legs stretched, hat shading his eyes. Solace grazed near the barn, the outline of her ribs still visible, but softer now in the light. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the wind brushing through her mane. It reminded him of the way his father used to hum while working on fence posts, low and steady. It wasn't until now he realized he'd missed that sound more than anything else. Later that evening, he drove into town. The diner's neon sign buzzed above the door, flickering between open and pen. Inside, Marla Dean poured coffee for 2 truckers at the counter. She looked up when Luke came in, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "Well, look who crawled out of his hole," she said. "What brings you to civilization, Tanner? Looking for ranch insurance again?" "Just coffee," Luke said, sliding into a booth. "And maybe a new gasket." Marla poured him a cup and leaned on the counter. "Heard you bought yourself a horse at the auction. You feeding it or praying over it?" Luke smiled faintly. "A little of both, maybe." "Well, she's got you out talking, so that's something." She handed him a flyer folded into quarters. "Jack Whitmore's selling off some irrigation gear next week. Old stuff, but works fine. You might want to take a look." Luke unfolded it. The black and white photo showed rusted pipes and valves, not unlike what lay buried in his field. "Thanks, Marla," he said. "Don't thank me yet. You'll need more than pipe if you're going to beat this drought. You'll need faith, and a good lawyer if the county comes snooping." Luke laughed quietly. One miracle at a time. On the drive home, the fields glowed red under the setting sun. The horizon shimmered with heat, but beyond it, Luke imagined he could almost see the outline of the ranch as it used to be. Green, full, alive. He reached the gate just as darkness settled. Solace lifted her head from the trough, nickering softly. "You waiting for me?" he said, walking over. He stroked her neck, feeling the pulse beneath the skin. "Guess you heard the news. We found it, girl. The old man's dream." She snorted lightly and leaned into his touch. In that moment, Luke realized she wasn't just an animal he'd rescued. She was a bridge, a reminder of something unbroken between generations. As night thickened, he sat beside the pump, listening to the quiet hum of insects and the whisper of water deep underground. The sky above was crowded with stars, more than he'd seen in years. Maybe they'd always been there, hidden behind drought dust and hopelessness, waiting for someone to look up again. He thought about his father's maps, about the note that said, "Don't forget where it sleeps." Maybe the old man had known it wasn't just a pipe he was burying, but faith itself, waiting to be uncovered. Luke reached down, scooped a handful of damp soil, and let it crumble through his fingers. "We're not done yet," he whispered, both to the horse and the earth. The wind carried the scent of rain that hadn't arrived. Faint, but undeniable. It was enough. The following week unfolded under a heat that didn't forgive. The wind carried grit like ground glass, biting at Luke's face as he worked to keep the pump alive. He'd managed to coax a small flow from the buried pipes, enough to dampen a few yards of earth. But now the engine groaned with every pull. The smell of hot metal mixed with oil and dust hung thick in the air. He crouched by the pump, tightening a stubborn bolt with his wrench. His knuckles were raw, streaked with rust and grease. The gauge needle twitched, then fell back to 0. He gave the machine a frustrated kick, the sound echoing across the empty field. Solace, standing nearby, lifted her head and snorted, the sound cutting through the hum of cicadas. "Yeah, I know," Luke muttered. "I should quit while I'm ahead." But quitting had never been something his father allowed. He wiped the sweat from his brow and tried again. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died with a soft rattle. Silence followed, heavy, complete. Luke sank back on his heels. His chest ached from exhaustion and something sharper. He realized he hadn't eaten all day. The house loomed behind him, quiet as a tomb. Bills still lined the kitchen table. The envelope from the bank sat unopened. He thought of Marla's advice. Call someone, get a licensed service, maybe refinance the mortgage. But pride ran thicker than water. He didn't have the money, and even if he did, this was something he had to do himself. He dragged the pump into the shade of the shed, sat on an overturned bucket, and stared at the field. The faint damp patches from the previous week had already turned to dust again. All that work, all that hope, vanished into the air like it had never happened. Solace wandered closer, her hooves quiet in the dirt. She nudged his shoulder once, a gentle reminder that she existed outside his failures. He reached up and scratched her under the jaw. "You don't give up easy, do you?" he said softly. The mare blinked, her amber eye clear and steady. Her clouded one reflected the glare of the sun like a mirror. He stood, stretched the stiffness from his back, and decided to check the far fence line. Sometimes work, any work, was better than thinking. The pasture spread out in waves of brittle grass, each step sending up a puff of dust. Solace followed without being asked, her shadow long beside his. At the far corner, one of the posts had given way. The wire sagged, rusted, and tired. Luke knelt, set the post straight, and hammered a new nail into the brace. He worked slowly, methodically. It was the kind of labor his father would have approved of. Quiet, honest, without promise of reward. When he finished, he leaned against the post and looked out toward the horizon. There, beyond the ridge, the land shimmered faintly. A mirage, maybe, or the heat bending light. But Luke thought he saw a darker line, a dip in the terrain he didn't remember. He squinted, heart quickening. "Come on, girl," he said. Solace pricked her ears and followed. They climbed the ridge, boots and hooves crunching against the dry soil. On the other side lay a shallow depression dotted with mesquite roots and wild sage. The ground there looked different, darker, softer. Solace stepped ahead, lowering her muzzle to the dirt, sniffing, then pawing once, twice. She lifted her head and looked at him, ears forward. "You smell it again, don't you?" Luke whispered. He knelt and pressed his hand to the ground. Cooler than it should have been. The faintest smell of moisture, so subtle it could have been memory. He laughed under his breath. "Guess you've still got your tricks." He went back for the shovel. The sun climbed higher, burning through his shirt, but he kept digging. Solace stood nearby, patient, her tail swishing at flies. The first few feet were dry and powdery, then the earth turned dense, clay-like. The color shifted from pale tan to a deeper brown. His heart pounded as the shovel bit deeper. And then it happened. The sound, soft but unmistakable, of water weeping from the soil. A few beads, then a thin trickle that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. Luke dropped the shovel and fell to his knees, laughing through breathless disbelief. "You did it again," he said, voice cracking. "You really did." Solace nickered softly, as if embarrassed by the praise. He dug wider, enough to let the water gather in a small pool. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, a fragile thing, but real. Luke cupped his hands, scooped a mouthful, and drank. The taste was metallic, heavy with earth, but to him it was sweeter than anything he'd ever known. He splashed some onto his face, letting it run down his neck, washing away the sweat and grit. But when he turned to the mare, her head was low, breathing heavy. He frowned. "Hey, you okay?" He stepped closer. Her sides rose and fell too fast. The scar around her neck pulsed faintly, the skin twitching. Luke ran a hand down her shoulder. The heat from her body was wrong, too much, feverish. "Damn it," he muttered. He led her back toward the barn slowly, whispering to keep her calm. She followed, though her steps faltered once or twice. Inside the stall, she drank greedily from the bucket. He brushed her coat, dampened her with cool water from the well, and waited until her breathing steadied. That night, the ranch was silent again. Luke sat on the porch with a beer gone warm, the stars above sharp as glass. He could hear Solace moving in her stall, the slow rhythm of her hooves shifting. He thought of the new water pocket, the faint shimmer of possibility. But his chest felt heavy, the old fear pressing in, the fear that nothing good ever lasted out here. He picked up his father's map again, tracing the lines in the dim light. The pipe didn't run anywhere near that new spot. Maybe there were more. Other hidden veins running under the soil, forgotten like everything else. Or maybe it was coincidence. Either way, he knew one thing. Solace had found something no man could have. He leaned back in the chair and looked toward the barn. "You saved me twice now," he said quietly. "Don't you dare quit on me." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and the faintest hint of damp earth. Somewhere, deep in the dark, a whip poor will called. Luke closed his eyes and listened. In the quiet, he could almost hear the slow heartbeat of the land returning, a fragile pulse that matched his own. By dawn, the air had changed. It was lighter somehow, holding a faint sweetness Luke hadn't felt in months. He woke to the sound of Solace stamping in her stall. Anxious. Alive. When he stepped outside, the sky was washed clean, a pale blue streaked with the faint blush of morning. The dust that usually hung in the air had settled overnight, leaving the hills oddly clear. He walked toward the barn with coffee in hand, the steam curling against the crisp air. Solace turned as he entered, her ears flicking forward. The fever from yesterday seemed to have broken. She pawed once at the straw. Restless. "Easy, girl," he said. "We've both had worse days." Luke saddled her lightly. She flinched when the strap brushed her scar, but didn't resist. He patted her neck and led her out into the pasture. The sun was rising behind them, its first light spilling over the fields in ribbons of gold. It caught on every strand of grass, every flake of dust, until the land seemed to glow. He guided Solace toward the ridge where the second pocket of water had appeared. When they reached it, the soil was still dark, still cool. Luke crouched, pressing his hand against it. "You knew," he murmured. "You always know." Solace lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. For a moment, Luke thought she looked almost regal, a creature out of place and time, carrying secrets the land had forgotten. He went back to the shed, started the pump again, and ran a new hose toward the depression. It coughed and rattled, belching out air and dust before settling into a slow rhythm. Luke waited, the vibration humming through the ground beneath his boots. A few minutes later, water began to seep from the hole, thin at first, then stronger. It shimmered in the morning light, a small but steady stream. He laughed, a sound raw and joyous. "Look at that, girl," he shouted, his voice echoing across the valley. Solace took a step closer, lowering her muzzle to the stream. She drank greedily, the water darkening her chin. Luke splashed some on his face, the coolness shocking against his skin. For the first time in years, the smell of wet soil filled the air. Rich, clean, unmistakably alive. He spent the rest of the morning digging a channel from the spring toward the main trough. The work was heavy, but he didn't mind. Sweat rolled down his back, mixing with dirt and satisfaction. The water followed, threading its way through the trench like a silver snake. When it reached the trough, he let it fill slowly until the reflection of the sky stared back at him. As he stood there, Luke realized the sound he'd been missing wasn't rain. It was this. The steady murmur of water finding its way home. It was small, but it was enough. He turned to Solace, who was watching him with calm intensity. "You just saved the whole damn place," he said quietly. "Maybe even me." That afternoon, neighbors started to show up, one by one. Word traveled fast in the hill country. Jack Whitmore arrived first in his dusty pickup, stepping out with the careful slowness of a man who'd seen too much dry land. "Heard you struck water," he said. "Guess you could call it that," Luke replied. Jack peered at the small stream and whistled. "That's more than luck. What did you do? Hire a driller?" "No, she found it." Luke nodded toward Solace. Jack raised an eyebrow. "That skinny mare?" Luke smiled. "She's got a good nose." By evening, more trucks had gathered along the fence line. People stared, muttering among themselves. Some laughed, others looked uneasy, as if seeing something they couldn't explain. A young boy wandered close and reached out to touch Solace's neck. She stood perfectly still. "She smells like rain," the boy said softly. The words settled over the crowd. Luke felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell them it wasn't a miracle, that it was just luck or instinct or something simple. But he couldn't say it. Because deep down, he knew this was more than coincidence. When the crowd finally thinned, Luke sat on the fence, the last rays of sun warming his back. Solace grazed quietly near the trough, her reflection trembling in the water. He thought of his father again, how he'd spent years chasing dreams that never came true, how he'd died believing the land had stopped loving them. "Maybe you were wrong, old man," Luke whispered. "Maybe it just needed someone to listen." As night fell, he lit the lantern in the barn. The light spilled across the walls, turning the rough boards golden. Solace lifted her head, eyes catching the glow. He brushed her coat, his hand moving slow and steady, careful not to touch the scar. The rhythm of it calmed him, like the heartbeat of something larger than both of them. He thought about all the words people threw around: market price, mortgage relief, property tax, farm loan, words that had no room for what was happening here. You couldn't quantify faith in a spreadsheet. You couldn't appraise a horse's instinct. Outside, the air cooled, and the land grew quiet again. The faint trickle of water was still there, whispering softly, the way fire does when it's almost gone, but not yet out. Luke leaned against the stall door, exhaustion heavy in his bones. Solace stepped closer, rested her head against his shoulder. For a long time, they stood like that. Two shapes framed by the fading lantern light. The well wasn't much, but it was alive. And so were they. When he finally turned out the light, the stars were blazing. The reflection of the trough glimmered like a piece of sky fallen to earth. He whispered, "Tomorrow we'll dig deeper." The mare's tail swished once, slow and certain. In that gesture, silent, ordinary, Luke felt the entire valley exhale. 2 mornings after the water started flowing, the road leading to Luke Tanner's ranch carried more dust than it had in years. Pickups came slow, leaving thin clouds behind them that lingered like ghosts. Word had spread about the horse, about the well that shouldn't exist. In a town starved of miracles, people always found their way to one. Luke stood by the fence, coffee cup in hand, watching the procession. He didn't invite them. He didn't have to. They arrived with folded arms and questions disguised as small talk. Old ranchers with sunburned necks, their wives in faded denim skirts, kids running wild between boots and fence posts. Marla Dean was there too, wiping her brow with a dish towel, curiosity shining brighter than judgment. "Looks like a fair out here," she said. "Didn't think you were in the tourism business, Luke." He smiled, though his jaw was tight. "Guess it's a limited engagement." They gathered near the trough, where the water shimmered faintly under the morning light. Solace stood nearby, her golden coat catching the sun like a reflection of the land itself. She didn't flinch at the noise or the pointing fingers. Luke noticed how calm she seemed, as if the attention wasn't about her, but about what the ground beneath her had finally decided to give. "Say it's the same mare you bought at the auction," a man called out, his tone half mocking, half amazed. "It is," Luke replied. "And she found that water?" Luke hesitated. The question hung in the air, ridiculous and reverent all at once. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe she just knew where to stand." That answer seemed to satisfy no one and everyone at the same time. The murmurs grew louder, turning into a buzz of speculation. Some folks crossed themselves, others chuckled and shook their heads. A few just stared, quiet, trying to decide if what they saw was faith or foolishness. Marla stepped closer to Solace, her hand hovering above the mare's neck. "She's not afraid," she whispered. "No," Luke said. "She's seen worse." Marla looked at him with something softer than curiosity. "You both have." As the crowd wandered the property, Luke found himself restless. He wanted to tell them to leave, to stop turning this quiet place into a spectacle. But he couldn't deny what he saw either. The way their faces softened when they looked at the running water, how they breathed a little deeper, as if remembering what hope felt like. For a town built on struggle, even a few drops of belief could make people forget the weight of debt and drought. He caught Jack Whitmore, leaning on the fence, studying the trench. "You sure this is real, Luke?" the older man asked. "Groundwater don't just show up out of nowhere." "I'm sure it's there," Luke said. "I'm not sure why." Jack spat into the dirt, thinking. "Well, whatever it is, you ought to protect it. County'll want to test it. The feds might too. They'll start talking water rights and property surveys. You'd best get yourself a good lawyer before somebody else claims it." Luke smiled tiredly. "A lawyer's the last thing this place needs." Jack gave a short laugh. "Maybe, but miracles have a way of attracting paperwork." By noon, the crowd began to thin. Marla lingered, helping a few kids toss pebbles into the trough, laughing when the ripples caught the sunlight. "You ever think maybe your dad knew?" she asked when they were alone. Luke turned toward the mesquite stump where his father's old pipe ran. "I think he hoped. That's close enough." Marla nodded, tucking the dish towel into her pocket. "Don't lose that. Hope, I mean. It's worth more than land around here." When she drove away, Luke finally exhaled. The ranch was quiet again, except for Solace's steady breathing. He sat on the fence, hat tipped low, staring at the shimmering water. The wind carried the smell of damp soil and gasoline from the pump. It was the scent of hard work and something almost holy. Later that evening, Sheriff Boyd pulled up in his patrol truck. He didn't step out right away, just sat there watching the last orange light fade from the hills. Finally, he climbed down, boots crunching gravel. "Heard you had half the county out here today," he said. Luke shrugged. "Guess folks got bored of bad news." Boyd studied the trough, the hoses, the faint trickle of water. "You know, Luke, when people get desperate, they start seeing signs in everything. You think maybe that's what this is?" Luke met his gaze. "I think it's water, and I think she found it." The sheriff's mouth twitched, part skepticism, part respect. "Well, whatever it is, it's giving folks something to talk about besides foreclosure and fuel prices. Ain't much harm in that." He walked back to his truck, paused with one hand on the door. "You take care of that horse, you hear? Around here, Faith is fragile. Don't let her break it." "I won't," Luke said. When the taillights disappeared down the dirt road, the world was still again. Luke walked to the barn, where Solace waited, half asleep. He brushed her coat in long, even strokes, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. The lantern light caught the faint ring of scar tissue around her neck, turning it silver. He thought of all the voices that had filled the ranch that day, laughs, doubts, prayers, and how quickly they had left, leaving behind only the soft sound of water and wind. The attention would fade soon enough. That was the way of small towns. Today's wonder became tomorrow's rumor. But the water would stay. The mare would stay. As he turned to leave, Solace shifted her weight, pressing her head gently against his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken. Trust, gratitude, the quiet language of survival. Luke smiled. "Guess it's just us again, girl." Outside, the stars gathered above the valley, their reflections trembling in the trough. The sound of the running water blended with the whisper of grass. For the first time in years, the land didn't sound empty. It had been 3 weeks since the first trickle of water, and every morning Luke still half expected to find the trench dry again, the miracle gone. But it wasn't. The flow had steadied, small but sure, feeding the trough and the cracked patches of pasture around it. The grass nearest the stream had begun to blush green, fragile shoots standing like children in church, trembling but alive. He woke before dawn now, not out of habit, but out of something that felt like anticipation. The land was different in the morning, a little softer, a little less cruel. Even the wind carried a different note, one that spoke less of despair and more of patience. The weather report on the old radio sat by the window like a ghost of modern life. The announcer talked about a low-pressure system forming off the Gulf, chance of rain by late Friday. Luke smiled faintly. He'd heard that before, every week for 2 years, the way people mention long-lost friends they no longer expect to see. Still, he caught himself glancing at the sky, looking for something heavy enough to believe in. Solace stood at the fence line, her mane tangled with dust. She'd filled out since the day he brought her home, her ribs now faint shadows instead of bones, her coat catching the early light like warm honey. She turned her head as he approached, snorting softly. "Morning, girl," Luke said, offering her half an apple from his pocket. She took it gently, her teeth brushing his palm. The horizon darkened by mid-afternoon. The air grew thick, electric. The windmills creaked and turned with sudden life. Luke paused in his work, leaning on the shovel, staring east. There, beyond the far hills, a gray wall began to rise, swallowing the light as it came. "Looks like they might have been right for once," he murmured. Solace lifted her head, too, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. A low rumble followed, distant thunder, soft but certain. He walked to the barn and began securing what he could. Tools, feed sacks, anything that might blow away. The smell in the air changed. Wet metal and ozone, the scent of real weather. His pulse quickened. It had been so long since he'd heard thunder that he'd forgotten how it sounded through the bones. When the first drop hit the brim of his hat, Luke froze. It rolled down, slow, heavy, like a memory he didn't trust yet. Then another, then a dozen more. Within seconds, the sky broke, open. Rain poured down in sheets, hitting the roof with the roar of applause. He ran outside, laughing, arms wide, letting the downpour soak him through. The water ran down his face, mixed with sweat and dust, streaking him clean. Solace kicked and spun in the pasture, her mane plastered against her neck, eyes bright. The world turned silver around them, mud, grass, sky, everything alive again. The trench filled quickly, the small stream swelling into a ribbon of moving light. The trough overflowed, spilling into the field, carrying bits of hay and leaves in a mad rush. Luke waded through ankle-deep water, laughing like a man possessed. "You did it, girl!" he shouted. "You called it!" The thunder cracked overhead, closer now. Solace stood still, head high, unafraid. Lightning forked in the distance, white veins across the horizon. The smell of rain mixed with the musk of earth, and Luke felt his chest ache, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. He thought of his father then, of the old maps, the pipe buried deep, the stubborn hope that had refused to die even when he did. The rain wasn't just water. It was inheritance, redemption, the earth remembering its promise. He turned toward the barn, but Solace stayed rooted where she was, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. A bolt of lightning struck somewhere beyond the ridge, and the shockwave rolled across the land like the breath of something ancient. She didn't move. Luke stopped, watching her. The image seared into his mind, this fragile, once broken creature standing proud in the storm, as if the sky itself had been waiting for her. The downpour lasted for hours. By the time it softened into drizzle, night had fallen. Luke stood on the porch, soaked and exhausted, listening to the steady drip from the roof. The smell of rain lingered everywhere, sweet, metallic, endless. In the trough's reflection, the stars flickered like they'd fallen into the water just to see for themselves. He lit the lantern and walked to the barn. Solace was there, breathing slow, her coat glistening in the light. He rubbed her neck, feeling the steady beat of her heart under his palm. "You brought it," he whispered. "You brought the rain." She turned her head and nuzzled his arm, a soft snort escaping her. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying cool air across the valley. The world, washed clean, smelled of promise. Luke leaned against the stall door, watching the mare settle into the straw. The sound of the rain had changed now. It was no longer a storm, but a song, steady and patient, filling the cracks of everything it touched. When he finally returned to the porch, he found himself staring out over the land, his father's words echoing in his head. "The land will always remember, son. You just have to remind it who it is." He smiled, a quiet, tired smile. "Guess we reminded it," he said aloud. In the distance, a single flash of lightning illuminated the ridge, and for an instant the whole valley glowed gold and alive. Luke closed his eyes, letting the rumble roll over him like a heartbeat. That night, he slept with the windows open, the smell of wet earth drifting through the house. The sound of rain against the tin roof was soft, like applause fading into prayer. Somewhere in the dark, Solace exhaled, a low, contented sigh, and Luke Tanner dreamed of rivers that never stopped running. When morning came, the world was unrecognizable. The valley shimmered beneath a thin veil of mist, and every blade of grass glistened with drops of rain that clung like pearls. For the first time in years, the ground no longer cracked under Luke Tanner's boots. It gave slightly, soft and living. The air smelled of cedar, wet soil, and the faint sweetness of renewal. He stood on the porch, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, listening to the steady dripping from the eaves. The land was quiet, but not silent. It breathed. Down by the pasture, Solace grazed lazily near the fence, her coat bright with reflected light. She looked different now, stronger, her muscles filled out, her steps sure. Even the scar around her neck seemed to have faded, replaced by a faint ring of lighter hair, a mark of survival rather than pain. Luke watched her lift her head, ears flicking toward the hills. She looked content, almost regal, like she belonged to this reborn earth more than any man ever could. He walked down to the trough, the mud pulling gently at his boots. The water shimmered with sky and cloud, a mirror to everything that had changed. He bent down and cupped it in his hands, tasting it once more, not because he was thirsty, but because he needed to be sure it was real. It was cool and clear. It was life. The pump still hummed in the distance, steady as a heartbeat. Luke smiled at the sound. He'd fixed the seal the night before, tightened the fittings, and reinforced the trench walls so the flow would last. He'd never imagined he'd hear that machine run smooth again. The whole ranch seemed to echo with small noises of work resuming. The creak of wet wood, the buzz of flies returning, the soft shuffle of hooves against damp ground. Later that morning, Marla's truck appeared at the gate. She waved from the driver's seat, her hair damp from the humidity. "Well, Tanner," she said, stepping out with her boots sinking in the mud. "Looks like heaven finally remembered Texas." He grinned. "Took its sweet time." She looked out at the pasture, whistling low. "Never thought I'd see green here again. Town's talking about it non-stop. You're a legend, you know. The horse-whispering farmer." "Don't start that," Luke said, shaking his head. "She just listened better than the rest of us." Marla smiled. "Maybe that's what makes you both special. You listened back." She reached into her jacket and handed him a folded piece of paper. "It's a list of folks asking if you'll come check their land. Seems they think your mare might be magic." Luke stared at the list, lines of names and phone numbers, most of them familiar. Neighbors, struggling ranchers, people who had nearly given up. He looked toward Solace, who was grazing near the mesquite stump, tail swishing. "I don't know if I can promise anything," he said quietly. "No one's asking you to promise," Marla replied. "They just want to believe again." He nodded slowly, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "Maybe we'll see what we can do." When she left, the valley fell back into its calm rhythm. Luke leaned on the fence, watching Solace. A bluebird landed on the wire beside him, shaking water from its wings. The sky above was a deep, endless blue, the kind that looked like forgiveness. By afternoon, the sun had dried the puddles, leaving the earth warm and clean. Luke took the old hammer and scrap of wood he'd saved since his father's days and walked to the hill overlooking the pasture. Solace followed, as she often did, without command. He drove the stake into the ground and nailed the wood to it. On it, he carved 4 words with his pocket knife: "For those who still listen." He stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. Solace stood beside him, her mane stirring in the soft wind. "It's not much of a monument," he said, "but I figure you don't need statues. Just a reminder." She nudged his shoulder, gentle and firm. He chuckled. "All right, you win. We'll call it yours." The afternoon passed slowly. The valley gleamed under the sunlight, alive in ways Luke had almost forgotten were possible. The cows wandered back toward the lower fields, finding patches of grass they'd abandoned long ago. Birds circled high, their cries sharp and bright. Even the air felt lighter. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Luke sat by the trough again. The light turned everything gold: the grass, the barn, the mare beside him. The water reflected the fading sky, and for a moment, it looked as if the heavens themselves were inside his reach. He thought about his father and the years of struggle, about the old maps drawn on feed calendars, about the line that said, "Don't forget where it sleeps." He had spent so long fighting the land, trying to force it to give, that he'd forgotten how to listen to it. Solace had reminded him, not through miracles, but through stillness, through patience. "You know what's funny?" he said softly. "I thought I was saving you. Turns out you were saving me." The mare flicked her tail, ears twitching toward his voice. He reached up and rested a hand against her neck. "You found what everyone else forgot was here," he whispered. "Not just the water, the will to keep going." Night settled gently over the valley. The crickets began their slow song. The sky bloomed with stars, each one mirrored in the trough below. Solace lowered her head to drink, and Luke watched the ripples fade into stillness. He felt no need to move, no need to speak. Tomorrow would bring more work, repairs, neighbors, paperwork, maybe even those farm insurance forms Boyd had mentioned. But tonight was not for that. Tonight was for the quiet victory of survival, for the knowledge that something once thought lost had returned. Luke stayed there until the lantern burned low. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and grass, the same scent that had begun this whole story. Solace shifted closer, her shoulder brushing against his arm. The simple contact grounded him more than any word could. In the faint light, the wooden sign on the hill caught his eye. The words shimmered faintly in the starlight. "For those who still listen." He smiled. "Guess that's us," he murmured. As the night deepened, the world grew utterly still. The pump clicked once in the distance, then steadied again. The valley breathed, and in that quiet, the kind that lives between heartbeats, Luke Tanner finally understood what it meant to belong, not to the land he'd inherited, but to the life he'd chosen to rebuild. If this story touched your heart, tell us what you felt in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more true stories about hope, second chances, and the quiet bond between people and horses.